You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Jim Robbins is joining us, so we're going to skip that break, and we'll keep talking on, and without that water, of course. But we're going to bring James S Robbins onto the show. Jim, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you?
Sorry, John didn't notice that you were there, so I thought I'd spare you the break, and we'll come right in with you. Jim, as always, it's a pleasure to have you on the Final Say Radio Show. And my gosh, there's never a shortage of things to discuss. I want to throw something out there because I just came across, and I don't know if you saw this yet or how familiar you are with this particular congressman. But, you know, here we are. We're starting to get involved in a Senate election to challenge Cory Booker. And I just saw, I think it was roll call, announced that Congressman Rush Holt isn't going to seek re-election, which I think is good news.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, so you can tell me why it's good news.
Well, Rush Holt is a liberal guy. I'm surrounded by. You're probably familiar with Chris Smith. Chris Smith is the committee head that oversees the human rights, and of course we'll get into a little bit of that because of the UN report that came out. But Chris Smith is my congressman, and he's done great work with regards to human rights issues around the world. And actually, you know, when they do good things, they do save lives in other countries because of the things that they look at and investigate and report on. And the other two that surround me, Frank Pallone and Rush Holt, are very liberal, and they were very responsible for that health care law that got passed, and they still think it's a great thing, and we're constantly battling on those issues. So I'm glad to see Rush Holt retiring. I'm glad Chris Smith isn't, and we keep trying to replace Frank Pallone. So I just, because let's face it, Jim, it's every congressman is up for election every 2 years, and the senators every 6, and we're constantly discussing these elections because they never seem to stop. And when you throw in state elections and special elections, it seems like every other day we have some election somewhere we're discussing. And, of course, usually we spend more time on, more household names and, of course, the presidential elections. But so I just threw that out there. Now, being that I brought up
since you threw it out, maybe I could comment on that because my congressman, Moran from Virginia 8, is retiring.
Oh, yes.
Well-known, leftist who's been in there a long time, 20 years or so. And, I'm glad he's leaving, but I live in one of the safest Democratic districts in the country. I think it went 70-30 for Obama in the last election. So really the question is not, are we going to get a good guy? It's how crazy is the person who replaces him going to be? And there's a massive fight going on in Democratic ranks right now to succeed Moran, because whoever gets that seat will have it for the rest of their life. They can just kick back and enjoy all of the perks of Congress. Personally, I would prefer to get someone who is lazy and doesn't do anything, because then they won't do any damage. But when I was at the George Washington's birthday parade that's held in Alexandria every year, which was yesterday, not President's Day, by the way. We celebrate George Washington's birthday. A lot of the Democratic candidates were there. They're in the parade. They were, trying to get people to sign up for their campaign. They were distributing their literature. And I spoke to one of them who was a self-described aggressive progressive. And everything, a former, he's like former communications director for Barney Frank. So, you can guess where he's coming from. And everything out of his mouth was just a platitude. It was like something that you would read on a bumper sticker, of a broken down Prius, just. The guy had no content, and I didn't build myself as, coming from the right or anything of the sort. He was just trying to chat up people about what a great guy he would be in Congress. And it'd be one thing if he was a liberal with ideas. But no, everything he said was just these short bursts of nonsense. And it's what passes, I'm afraid, for politics these days. I'm sad to say on our side, too, sometimes. But
yeah.
Just really, really bad stuff. And I know this guy has no chance of winning because he was just so far out. I think he's too far out even for Moran's district. But it just goes to show the kind of folks that are out there. So, I'm glad when someone is leaving the Congress who probably should get out. But then I have to wonder, wow, could it get worse? I think it can.
Well, that's a good point, Jim. The interesting thing is, in this case, there are some congressmen who have backgrounds who've done interesting things, and in both parties, but I'm referring to the Democratic Party at this point, who you would look at them and say, you know what, they're some of them are pretty decent people and smart, and they've had successful businesses, but then you see how they perform, and in the case of the Democratic Party, it's like they get in line. In other words, the leader or whoever's giving the order gives the order, everybody gets in line, and everybody does what they're supposed to, which doesn't occur in the Republican Party, not nearly to the extent like that. And so it's not a matter of like who you're electing. It's like it's the Democratic Party that's the issue. And so I just figure if we could just replace them, then we don't have to deal with it. Now, your district may be a lost cause, but I think we've shown some pretty close elections here, close meaning within 5 to 10 points, which I think when you get rid of the incumbent takes away that 5 to 10 points. So, yeah, you never know. Maybe we'd pick one off. And, God knows New Jersey needs some help.
Oh, yeah, and more than one. I mean, this is going to be a winning year for Republicans, and everybody knows it. The Democrats have to hang together because they'll hang separately otherwise. And the disputes in the Republican Party are actually a virtue because, number one, they force our side to hone the debate a little better. But number two, it's reflective of the diversity in the party. And this is something that I think Republican leaders should try to turn to their advantage. When you have Democrats furiously trying to say that the Republican Party is like the extremist party or something like that, well, clearly not. We have Tea Partiers, we have Libertarians, we have traditional conservative Republicans, even some moderate Republicans hanging around. It's the Democrats who are the ones who are lockstep on a hard left agenda with no dissent. As you point out, this is why they can get together so well, because there's no dissent, there's no diversity in thought on their side. There's nothing. There's just sort of hanging on for dear life, at least congressionally. The only place where you see any sort of diversity at all is in the Senate, where in order to hang on to their majority, you have a bunch of senators now running away from their deeply held convictions and basically misrepresenting themselves as some kind of moderates or free thinkers or something like that, which we know they're not, in order to try to preserve their chances for re-election in a country that is fed up with the way that the country is being run. They're fed up with plans that don't work, with endless borrowing and debt, an economy that's stalled, no jobs, and so forth, and they correctly blame big government liberal policies for this. So when these senators on the left are trying to present themselves as moderate or they were opponents of Obamacare or something like this, it's just a great big lie, and everybody knows it. And they're in for a rude awakening in November. I mean, I really can't wait.
Well, I think as much as we were upset, and we sat there in front of the Supreme Court, literally just in shock with the whole Obamacare passage. However, that may very well be the death blow to the Democratic Party, because as much as the Democrats and much of the news are trying to say it's the end of republicanism, and granted we do have some poor leadership in the Republican Party right now, but everybody with an ounce of intellect realizes that when you have every place you turn, you're seeing healthcare fail and hundreds of millions of dollars dropped here and there as if they were candy being thrown out of a kid's piñata. And we're getting nothing of value for it. So I do think that the Democratic Party hung their hat on this, and the Republican Party has to hang the Democrats for hanging their hat on this healthcare debacle. So I'm looking forward to seeing this play out. And Brett, before you change the subject, I just have to take exception with you, at least at the national level. I think the Republicans, unfortunately, have done a really poor job of getting in line and putting who's the next candidate, like John McCain or Bob Dole or others who may have been good guys and did some important things in their day, but were clearly not the best candidate to solve the country's problems. So sadly, I think the Republicans also suffer from that malady.
Yeah, well, that part you're correct on, but what I was referring to is you still have the 30 or 40 very conservative or libertarian members of the House, at least, who will not get in line, and they will vote against a bill, even though leadership's desperately trying to get them to come along, and that's why you need to get those handful of Democrat votes to pass some of these things. So that's the important thing. But anyway, Jim, there was a report that came out with regards to North Korea, and, these reports also look at other places, but this specifically looking at North Korea and their treatment and a whole mess of human rights violations, from the brutality in their prison camps to, I believe from what I read in some of the press releases, where the word used extermination of people. So, you don't get much worse than that. That's really referring to genocide-like tactics towards various people who don't agree with what Kim Jong-un is doing. And I think that, I think it's important that they do these reports, and it's certainly we want to look out for the rights of people who certainly can't look out for their own. But I guess the question for you is this report going to have any teeth? Is there anything that we're going to be able to do, considering that most likely China and maybe even Russia together will vote against any resolution that the UN comes up with?
Right, bearing in mind that this comes from the United Nations. So right away we know that probably nothing's going to get done. I am delighted that the UN is focusing on something useful for a change. That's very good of the UN. They should do more of this, of focusing in on the real problems in the world. Whether it leads to anything, I doubt it. And also, it's not as though this stuff wasn't known. This was very well known by anybody who looks into it, of what's going on in North Korea. But it's great that the top international body gives its imprimatur to a study that people can then refer to. It's one thing to refer to things that come from Korean dissidents or people like that. You could say, well, they have an interest in not being exterminated. Yeah, I'd say so. But some people question the motives of folks like that. But it's harder to question the motives of the United Nations. So in that respect, I think it's a great thing. But I don't think it's going to lead to any concrete changes, and there will never be anything positive happening in North Korea while the current regime is in power. The United States has not done much, I must say, to try to change the situation. We're much more interested in stability because there's the classic fear that if we try to do anything, overthrow the regime, that this would lead to a destabilization, and the first victim would be South Korea. Our allies, they're our friends, and we don't want to rock the boat, and the South Koreans don't want us to rock the boat. So we don't do anything. But the United States, there's a lot, I think, that we could do that wouldn't involve an invasion or bombing or something like that, that would help deal with the North Korean situation. And it's not just the human rights angle. North Korea is a major nuclear proliferator. They work with Pakistan. They work with Iran. They're a problem. The number one counterfeiter in the world, when you talk about destabilizing foreign currencies, or the number one producer of American currency outside of America. They are involved in the drug trade. They're involved in a lot of bad things. So, international arms smuggling, human trafficking, you name it. So there are reasons, besides the human rights angle, for us to get involved in solving North Korea problem. But for some reason, we don't do it. So if anything, the UN, it's nice, but if the United States could get going on something, even using the tools at our disposal currently under UN mandates that have given us certain powers to do things that we haven't done, I think it would be fantastic. But I certainly don't see it coming from this president.
Well, actually, we've seen quite the opposite. So everybody remembers the comment that we heard from the president about, we'll extend our hand if you're willing to unclench your fist. That was the direct quote from Obama. And this was actually when he was candidate Obama in 2007. Now, there's a big lesson to be learned. And we often talk about the Middle East and we talk about Iran getting the bomb and the similarities to pre-World War I or II. But actually, Korea is one of the most salient and near-term relevant examples, because we did not play hardball with Korea and we did not play hardball with China. And because we actually played, you might recall, Clinton had Madeleine Albright, who all these people praised, but quite frankly, I think Madeleine Albright was a complete and total failure. And Madeleine Albright went in there and she shook hands and hugged and kissed with Kim Jong-il. And you may recall, very shortly after, he was playing Machiavelli with her. They got the nukes. They shared the nukes, and we never, ever had the upper hand in negotiating like we did before. And it just shows that this idea of reaching out didn't work then, and it's not going to work now. It's not working with Iran, and Iran is actually following virtually the exact same roadmap that was laid out for them brilliantly, to their credit, by the North Koreans, and America and the world is going to be a far more dangerous place because of it.
Well, I couldn't agree more. The 90s was such a travesty of our constructive engagements, so-called, with North Korea that led them to develop a nuclear weapon. Now all we try to do is contain them, and we're not even doing that very well, certainly not where it counts on things, particularly a proliferation issue. But the downside of containment as a policy is you have to accept all of the stuff going on in that UN report. If your policy is we're just going to contain the issue and then wait for it to go away, whether it implodes or whatever happens, then you are implicitly saying, okay, whatever happens inside the containment zone is okay by us. So if they're exterminating their people, stamping out dissent, starving their population, whatever it is, if all you're doing is containing, then you're saying, okay, fine, well, go ahead and do that, and we'll just keep waiting. Well, I think that we can do more than just keep waiting. I think that we should adopt a national policy to deal with this in some fashion. I'm not saying invade it or anything like that, but we have ways of destabilizing that regime that we should use that we're just not doing.
Well, yes, and you mentioned earlier that South Korea doesn't necessarily want us rocking the boat either. But sometimes you have to do what's just in the best interest of the best interest. And we failed to do that in different periods in history. And then we look, we read the history today and we say, oh, I can't believe we made that mistake. But hey, guess what? We're doing it again today. Now, Jim, we could talk about North Korea all day, but I want to, as we've done several times, take a quick look at Ukraine. And I think this is important for two reasons, above and beyond the things we've already discussed. But now you have situations where, I'm looking at a report here, you have 9 people dead, including policemen, so it's becoming more violent. And from other things that I've been reading and following, it seems to me that there are also, beyond the people who are just looking for different changes in Ukraine and removing President Yanukovych from power, I think there are some extremist-type groups that are getting now involved, which is probably why the level of violence and things are escalating. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, sure, because these extremist groups are opportunists, and whether they're anarchists or communists or whoever, that's what they're going to do if they have an opportunity to cause trouble. And I don't want to compare it directly to Syria because it's not that bad, but just in one small aspect, which is if you don't get involved in a crisis supporting the people you like early in the crisis, you may be left later having no one to support. So in the case of Ukraine, if it becomes a contest of radical versus radical, each worse than the next, then how do you have any meaningful policy towards that crisis? If there's no one to say, hey, there's a good guy, let's support them. Now, maybe the U.S. doesn't even have an interest, and we could just say the heck with it. Well, maybe so, but, this is Europe, after all. It's not the kind of thing we want to see spreading to other countries. So hopefully there's some kind of engagement going on with somebody regarding Ukraine, whether it's U.S. or, the European community or somebody. even get the Russians involved, although I know there's not a lot of trust there between, the Ukrainians and the Russians. But, if you just let it go, like we have done, like in Syria, again, not making a direct correlation, but just saying it's the nature of a crisis. If you just let it go, it's going to get worse and worse.
Yeah, a quick comment, and then John has something to say regarding Turkey. But, it seems that the Russians obviously don't want us to be involved with what's going on in Ukraine because they want Ukraine under their wing, and they want that Eurasian Union, if you will, a smaller form of the former USSR. And, of course, Europe wants the opposite. And, of course, I would hope, recognize that it's in our best interest for Russia to grow no more than they already have with the influence, as we see them, becoming more influential in countries such as Egypt and even Turkey and more so in Iran than they've been. And, so these are global issues that we will have to deal with in upcoming decades. So I wish the president would be more engaged than just hearing a press release that somebody in his, in his State Department made some sort of a comment that was taped by the Russians and released to the public to cause a rift with the Europeans, right?
Yeah, exactly. But, again, if we say that we want, that we should be engaging, that presupposes that we have people who have the skill to do it, or, the foreign policy acumen to deal with crisis management and things like this. And frankly, with the current administration, the talent pool is pretty shallow. So maybe the U.S. getting involved isn't the best idea. Maybe Europeans getting involved. Maybe they have some people who can handle things, because clearly we do not.
Jim, I think you're being quite generous. I think you mean to say talent puddle with this administration. I want to point to another very important part of the world, a little bit south of the Ukraine. You look at what's going on in Turkey right now. It's hard to imagine. Turkey's actually been a long-time part of NATO. And now you have to scratch your head and wonder, why in the world would they even be part of NATO? We have they literally are piece by piece becoming an Islamist state, and not necessarily by the will of the people, but by the coercion and enforcement of the government. And you just saw, as of this week, the president of Turkey, Gül, has been creating a whole bunch of new regulations because he wants tighter controls over the courts and the internet. And of course, Jim, this is a result of the one glimmer of hope that we've seen recently out of Turkey, is that the courts have actually been turning around and taking Erdogan to task, because they're realizing that if they continue on this path toward being a radical Islamist nation, a competitor, if you will, to regional hegemony against Iran, the net result is going to be awful for Turkey. And so there's a bit of a hedge there. But again, you hear silence from the White House, Jim. That shallow puddle barely makes a splash.
Well, again, are they capable of dealing with it? Do they know how to? I mean, are they engaged on just the idea of the problem of a radical Islamist Turkey, right? Maybe they think it's a good idea. I have no doubt that the folks in the White House would say that if Turkey goes down the Islamist path, well, so what? The people have spoken, right? That's what they said about Egypt. And, who knows? I don't think it would be, I don't think they would lift a finger if there was, if the regime in Turkey then just went full-blown Islamist, sort of rip the mask off. Because we know what they're doing. They're sort of moving there by salami tactics. But if they just, declared it, I don't think the White House would care. They'd probably celebrate it. They'd send them a bunch of flowers if they did that. So the first step is identifying that there's a problem, and I don't even think the White House would do that.
Jim, what's sad about all of these regions is the fact that if we had if we had a quality president with a talented team right now, think of all the advances that would have been going on. For instance, in 2009 with the Green Revolution in Iran, we probably would have had a regime change, or at least significant changes, because they would have had to. And it was almost like we ended that, I can't believe what we did there. And, of course, all the offspring of Iran and all that influence that comes about would have disintegrated. The mess in Egypt would have gone down much differently. And Syria probably would have been cut off. Maybe they would have had protests, but they might not have spiraled into an all-out civil war where roughly 130, 150,000 civilians have been killed and communities have been razed to the ground. You just look at all these different areas. And the reason I say that, when you study, and I know you have for many years, but when you study the history, especially in this region, you know that it's like a roller coaster. It swings back and forth from extreme to from extreme to moderate to it never gets normal. But, and I think some of these countries are at the point where they're either going to go from moderate to extreme or from extreme to moderate. So when we stop the transformation of extreme to moderate, but we help the moderate go to extreme, it seems to me that we're if you will, bass backwards on all these areas. And that's exactly what I would consider the president to be.
Well, I think the results on that are clear. If you look around the world and see all of the areas in which the United States has facilitated that retrograde motion. And it hasn't served our interests, certainly. I think that there's a certain degree of ideology behind it as opposed to interest. And that ideology is flawed, and it's a mistake. But it's kind of too late in the game for this administration to correct it, because now, as has been said, our enemies no longer fear us and our friends no longer trust us.
No, in fact, I would imagine that quite a few of them are patiently waiting for 2016. But anyway, Jim, we're unfortunately at the end of our time with you this week and toward the end of the program. So I want to thank you again, as always, for joining us. And I'm patiently waiting for your new book to come out. But if you'd like to give a quick plug for it while we're waiting for the printing, that would be great.
Oh, sure. It's The Real Custer, From Boy General to Tragic Hero by Regnery. It comes out on Father's Day, so you have to wait till June, but right around the time of the anniversary of the Battle of Little Bighorn. So it makes the perfect gift.
Excellent. I will. I'm going to get one for Father's Day, I'm sure. Jim, have a great week. And we'll talk to you next week on Tuesday, as always. Anyway, take care.
Okay, thanks. Okay, bye-bye.
Again, the great James S. Robbins. It's always good to have Jim on. Jim's been following so many of these issues for so long that, he's got a memory that's pretty unbelievable.